Okay, so this topic is about variables and data types. In this video, we're going to be looking at how data is represented in a program and how the different ways that we represent that data change how we can use it. So before we get started, by the way, I'm Dr. Jamila Mitchell in Orlando, Florida. So happy to be teaching you this today. We are ultimately, by the end of this, going to understand the different types of data that we can use in a Java program and how that data can be characterized as either primitive or reference data, and what kind of operations we can do with that data. So getting started first, what is primitive data? Of course, primitive data determines the size and the type of information that we can work with in a Java program. So when we're looking at data in a Java program, we can represent it. In this course, we focus primarily on 3 different types that we represent that data. So the smallest form, one of the smallest forms of data that we can represent is Booleans as either true or false. We can also represent data as ints, which is whole numbers. So we can use those to represent just simple basic values. And of course, since it is an int and they are whole numbers, I can add, I can subtract, just like I can multiply and all the sorts of things that I can typically do with whole numbers. Then I also have doubles, which are my decimal values. So, and they're also referred to as floating point numbers. I can also represent data as text. So for example, our hello world that we've seen before. Notice it's in quotation marks since it is text, but I can refer to this text as a welcome message and store that information so that way welcome message can refer to that text. I can also use data types for reference purpose. So like these bows, even though they are all bows, the way that I would refer to each of these bows would be different. I might refer to this one, for example, as a big silver bow. This one might be little blue bow, and so forth. So just to recap, of course, we have Booleans, which are true or false values. We have integers, which represent our whole numbers. And we have doubles, which represent our floating point numbers. A Boolean, since it is one of the smallest data types in programming, typically only just takes up 1 bit, since it is only true or false. Ints typically take up 32 bits and have a wide range of numbers that we can cover there. And then doubles typically take up 64 bits and can represent pretty large decimal numbers as well. So what's the difference between all these different types? So just to recap some of the things that we just talked about, primitive types, of course, are already part of the Java language. It's not anything that I have to create. And other than string, I can create additional types as needed for those non-primitive reference types like my bows. Non-primitive types can use methods to perform different actions, which we'll talk more about in Unit 2 and Unit 5, but primitive types cannot. They can't do things, but I can do things with them. So let's practice. So when we're looking at these different, I have some example data types here and some example data. So when I'm looking at what I can use, an int would probably be best fit with my 1995 here because it is a whole number. Double, I could assign the 1.62 since that's a decimal number. Boolean would then be my true, since that is one of the 2 values that I can use with a Boolean. And then string would be my string, my text here, James Gosling, which is helpful to note those quotation marks. That's what helps tell me that that's a string. So when I'm trying to decide what kind of data I should use when I am writing a program, I can keep those different data types in mind. So for example, if I'm trying to decide what kind of type I should use to hold a student's average course grade, since it's an average, I might wind up with a decimal number. So in that case, decimal numbers are stored as doubles. If I'm trying to decide how I should store how many students are in a class, well, I can't have part of the number of students. I can't have true or false students, number of students. And if I stored it as a string, it would be text, and I can't do math with a string. So an int would be most appropriate for storing the number of students that are in my class. When I'm trying to decide what type I should use to hold the name of my favorite movie, that's text. It's definitely not a whole number. It's not a decimal number, and it's not going to be a true or false value. So I should use a string to store the name of my favorite movie. And then if I'm trying to decide what kind of type I should use for storing whether or not I have a pet, here I'm looking at the question of the pet. So that kind of question would come out to yes or no. And I can use true or false to represent those yes or no's. So in this case, I could use a Boolean. So just to recap, we've talked about the different types that we can store data in a program, how those types can be categorized as primitive or reference, and the type of operations that we can do with the different types of data that we have. Thanks, and see you next time.